Hello, Wellness Dailies. This is the Wellness Table podcast, and this is where we untangle the web of nutrition and wellness, how to fight disease with food and how we live, and even what to make for dinner. I'm your host, Dr. Cheryl Bothwell, and whether you're listening on a commute, if you're listening on your favorite podcast platform, or maybe you're watching on YouTube, I hope that you remember to subscribe and help us grow this show. It really makes a difference. I'm so glad that you're here, and I'm excited about today's podcast. Welcome to the table, and let's get into today's show. So last week, when we talked about this tidal wave of cancer headed our way, we talked about there's going to be a rise, it's projected, of 80% of tumors and cancer diagnoses by the year 2050. And this is alarming because we're seeing this spike in cancers among those under the age of 50. These are lung, breast, prostate, colorectal, stomach, cancers of the GI. So why are we having this surge and what can we do about it? So today we're going to dive into how can we ride that cancer prevention wave and that disease prevention wave. And the most important thing is, are we aware of the risk factors that are fueling this trend? The first on the list was an unhealthy diet, physical inactivity, heavier alcohol consumption that we're seeing in the younger population or people born after 1965, and an increase in smoking and vaping. And despite better screening with mammograms, colonoscopies, we know that we're revealing more cancers, but we're still left with this mystery. Why are those that are born after 1965 experiencing faster biologic aging? And we're going to be seeing more and more about this in the latest in science. But I want to talk today about the good news that 50% of these cancers are preventable by eliminating tobacco, embracing a healthy diet, staying more active, and limiting our alcohol consumption. These can make big differences. So this is about how we eat and about how we live, that we can lower our risk by over 50%. Now that's great news. But today I wanted to hit on that healthy diet was at the top of this list. Living a healthy body weight was very important. And so what I found challenging and what I see challenging as I look at the science is I look at what we're seeing on Instagram posts, what we're seeing on podcasts and YouTube content coming out from health professionals, coaches, influencers alike, is a discrepancy in what is a healthy diet. There seems to be a lot of confusion. And why is that? What constitutes a healthy diet? And why do more than half of us believe in surveys that we're eating healthy, and yet when actually assessing how we're eating, only 1 out of 10 are eating a healthy diet? What is the disconnect when we believe we're eating healthy and yet less than 1 out of 10 is actually eating a healthy diet? What's missing in our diet, and how can we really define what eating well means? So let's get into that in more detail. First, we want to talk about unraveling the healthy diet myth. So let's peel back the layers on dietary myths. And astonishingly, again, when the surveys are indicating that 90% of Americans have a poor diet, few meet the vegetable intake recommendations, and only 25% are exercising regularly. And even more concerning is when we put this all together, only 2.7% of the American population is eating healthy, exercising enough, not drinking too much, limiting their alcohol intake, and not smoking, and at an ideal body weight. So we're talking about 2.7% of the population actually meets this healthy living and healthy lifestyle, healthy diet criteria. That's alarming. And that may have a lot to do as we're looking at this trend of an 80% increase in tumors and cancer. That may be part of it because we can look at how are we eating, what are our lifestyle choices. As we look at what the CDC reports, that there's a drastic shortfall in daily fruit and vegetable intake. And the CDC reports that 90% of Americans don't eat enough fruits and vegetables. That, again, is where we're getting that data of 1 out of every 10 are Americans don't eat enough fruits and vegetables. And when we look at the Harvard data, it highlights the dominance of low quality carbs and animal saturated fats in the American diet. So 42% of the American diet is still coming from low quality carbs, sugars, processed foods, and 12% coming from saturated fat. So it's like they comment at Harvard, it's like turning a massive battleship when we're trying to change eating patterns. Well, the first step in changing them is to even understand what a healthy diet is. And when I talk to people, I find it to be so interesting when they'll say to me, I'm really following a healthy diet. And then I start to talk about what that looks like and how they're eating. And I don't see the connection. Their definition of eating a healthy diet is very skewed from what the science says and what I have learned studying nutrition, a doctor of clinical nutrition, a registered dietitian, a wellness expert, and 20 plus years of clinical experience applying it. And when I see all of that, and yet somebody will look at, again, an influencer and look at how they look, and we tend to look at someone's body as their business card instead of their training. And that might be leading us into having all of this information that is so inaccurate or so confusing because we may not be talking to health experts. So that part I get. But today we're going to talk about how health professionals are actually not in agreement. So that leaves it very difficult for us to try to weed through all of this and figure out what it's about when, as health professionals, we're not even all on the same page. The World Health Organization defines a healthy diet, and they recommend eating at least 5 portions or 5 servings of fruits and vegetables every day, and to ensure that we're getting enough dietary fiber. They also recommend reducing the amount of fat that we eat every day to less than 30% of our total energy to prevent an unhealthy weight gain in the adult population. They also recommend less than 10% saturated fat. They've also added is reducing trans fats, these hydrogenated fats, to less than 1%. We ultimately don't recommend trans fats or hydrogenated fats. So we're going to see some of those in some of our margarines and a lot of our processed foods because it increases shelf life, specifically when we're using a plant-based fat. And I think that the trans fat train that came in, and when New York City said no trans fats for our city, and they were trying to take a stand on this, I thought it was incredible. But the movement that followed it was, let's move back to butter. Let's move back to saturated fats that are animal source. And that's where the World Health Organization is not in agreement. They're saying to decrease or eliminate trans fats, these hydrogenated plant-based fats, but to also continue to reduce saturated fat to 10%. So that's definitely not part of the World Health Organization messaging, is that butter is the better switch. It's recommending really low on both of those. The other that they go after is the low salt, low sodium intake, lowering that and increasing potassium. We've talked a lot about how when we're looking at blood pressure, how many people in the population have hypertension, and it's because they're salt sensitive, and how much sodium we eat as a population. We average 9 to 12 grams of salt per day and very low in potassium. Well, when we think about these low fruits and vegetable intake, that's where we find our potassium, is in these plant foods. So when we're not eating enough fruits and vegetables, we're not getting enough potassium. So what we're doing is we're driving a lot of the sodium in our diet, and we're too low on the potassium. And how this affects the cell and fluid shifting, this is where we can start to contribute to high blood pressure, and it increases our risk for heart disease and stroke. So part of my strategy has been to raise potassium. And for people that don't want to be on these extremely low sodium diets, I'm like, let's boost potassium. In the Take 10 program, I had a potassium to sodium ratio of 2.5 to 3 times the potassium to the sodium. And that formula for me, that lowered blood pressure, and it allowed us to eat a little bit more salt and have more flavor, and just boom the potassium up. So we'll talk more about that in another future podcast, but I do want to highlight that sodium and potassium are very important for our overall health and well-being. We have to talk a little bit about sugar, because that's where the World Health Organization is saying that we need to decrease our free sugar intake, that processed sugar, to less than 10% of our total energy. And again, these are public health worldwide goals. So they try to do something that's very realistic that people can actually achieve. So they're highlighting salt. We're eating too much salt, not enough potassium, which is our fruits and vegetables, and we're eating too much refined sugars and too many trans fats and saturated fats, and not enough fiber. This is sort of the summary of where the World Health Organization is going. And also, they talk about obesity, that almost 40% of the United States adults are obese, and another 31, almost 32% are overweight, and almost 8% are considered severely obese. So as we look at a healthy diet, we always want to look at not just what type of diet pattern are they on, not just the macronutrients that they're eating, but we also want to look at how many total calories that somebody has as well, and how much they're exercising, and put that whole package together, because being at an ideal body weight is very important. And when we talked about angiogenesis, where we can be driving blood vessels to improve circulation, when we look at body fat, it has to be fueled. And so it makes us more angiogenic, and that is fueling the flames for growing more tumors. So we've got these microscopic tumors that we want to die with our tumors, not from them. And we can have these microscopic tumors, but if they don't have a blood supply, we starve them. And the body's natural health defense either just removes them naturally, or they don't get a blood vessel supply and they do not grow. And that's the goal, because we know that people 70 and above, 100% of them will have microscopic tumors and autopsy, but they did not die from cancer. So that's very important for us to understand the importance of angiogenesis fueling cancer. So being overweight really can set us up to be at a higher risk for cancer, is the short story of that, on top of heart disease and the other risk factors that come along with it. So as we look at a healthy diet, we must always look at a healthy body weight as well. Frank Hugh has an article. He's a great researcher, and his article is on diet strategies on promoting healthy aging and longevity. And it's an epidemiologic perspective. And he defines healthy longevity. And this is, again, where we're talking about how many years of good health do we have as we approach our biologic lifespan, and we look at our physical, cognitive, and social functioning that enable our well-being. So as we look at what are the findings on dietary factors that are affecting chronic disease and longevity, and primarily those from large cohort studies, and he outlines these in this paper. And the first on the list was maintaining a healthy body weight throughout life. It was pivotal for healthy aging and longevity. So calorie restriction was something that was very important for healthy aging and longevity. And he quotes a body mass index range of 18.5 to 22.4, and increasing levels of physical activity and a healthy diet had the lowest mortality, suggesting that leanness induced by healthy diet and lifestyle is optimal for longevity. And I think it's important to put leanness induced by a healthy diet and lifestyle, because we can be lean and not do it with a healthy diet. And then we can still be raising our risk for cancer, raising our risks for chronic disease. So this is a package of eating healthy, living and making healthy lifestyle choices, and having a healthy body weight, because we can lower our body weight by doing meth and find that, yeah, we'll drop weight by taking certain medications, but that may not be a healthy body weight. And we won't see these types of data if we're not eating a healthy diet and living a healthy lifestyle. So they go hand in hand. The second was the types and the food sources: dietary fat, protein, carbohydrate. We look at those as the macronutrient makeup and how they influence the chronic disease risk. So we first looked at what our body weight is, like how many calories we're eating, how that works out with our body, and are we eating healthy food? And then we look at the sources, the food sources, and their risk on influencing chronic disease and mortality. And as we look at these studies, we're finding in these large cohort studies that we're looking at the type of fat, the type of dietary fat, the type of protein, and the type of carbohydrate is the most important influence on disease risk and mortality, far above their quantity. So as we look at how many grams of protein, I see people counting grams of protein all the time. And what these studies are showing us is that it's more important the type of protein rather than the grams of protein. Also, as we look at the types and the total dietary fat, the type of fat was really important in determining long risk of mortality. So specifically, when we saw in these studies higher intakes of unsaturated fats, these are found primarily in plant-based foods and marine fish, they were associated with lower mortality risk. And as we look at, and they were inversely associated with mortality. And on the other hand, higher intakes of these trans fats and saturated fats were associated with increased mortality, and the adverse effect of trans fat was substantially stronger than those of saturated fat. I was asked the question like 20 years ago a lot, should I have butter or margarine? Which one's the worst of the two evils? And I think as we look at the Mediterranean diet and we look at the some of the work that Dr. William Lee has done, and we talked about it in the last couple of podcasts, that extra virgin olive oil is their butter in the Mediterranean. And I think that's where they do neither. They're not doing a saturated fat or a trans fat, and they're dipping their bread and they're using these really quality olives, and cold pressed quality olive oil would be my vote. But I grew up loving butter or margarine, I would say, is what I grew up with. And that's the trans fat. So now we're seeing more of the margarines that are not made with trans fats. We also see a lot of people have moved back to butter because of the fear of these trans fats. And how has that affected our cancer and disease risk? And I think it's concerning to me because there isn't science to back up moving back to butter. And we definitely have the science not to do trans fats. So if we were hanging our hat on extra virgin olive oil, that would be our first choice, and not having more than 10% of saturated fats in our diet. So the food source of fat, whether it was plant or animal, may also affect the health outcome. So even when we're considering the same type of fat, so if we replaced 5% of our energy from a saturated fat, a trans fat, a refined carbohydrate with a MUFA, which is a monounsaturated fat, that's from a vegetable oil, nuts, seeds, avocados, there was a lower risk of coronary heart disease. When they substituted a MUFA from an animal source, we didn't get the same benefits. So a monounsaturated fat from a plant source, we're talking about vegetable oils, the olive oil, the nuts, seeds, and avocado, associated with the lower risk of coronary heart disease. Monounsaturated fats from animal sources, it's in beef, it's in all the different animal foods, did not have the same benefit. I think that's an important note to make as we're talking about animal sources and plant sources and where we're getting these foods. The carbohydrates, the long-term health benefits of a low carbohydrate diet. We're talking about low carb diets, keto diets, paleo diets, starting out with the Atkins diet decades ago. And what are the long-term effects of a low carb diet? It really depends on the type of fat and protein that is in the diet and the impact of those low carb diets. And I think that's really important for us to look at, is that if we're pulling back on carbohydrates, what are we replacing them with? So looking at a 20 to 26 year follow-up study, the overall low carbohydrate diet was weakly associated with all-cause mortality, but a higher animal low carbohydrate diet score was associated with a higher all-cause and cancer mortality. So again, we're looking for what is causing the trend or this tidal wave of tumors. Here could be one of them, is that we have moved very much to a low carb diet. And as we look at using animal foods with a low carb diet, was associated with higher all-cause and cancer mortality. That's concerning. But on the other hand, a higher vegetable low carbohydrate score, emphasizing plant sources of protein and plant sources of fat, was associated with lower mortality and cardiovascular mortality. So I think this is a really key point here, because we're always looking at carbohydrate. Should we have a low carb, high carb? And I think it really depends on how we're replacing, what are we exchanging it for, those calories, because we're going to eat so many calories to be full. So if we're exchanging that and we're pulling back on, let's say now we've stopped eating 20 grams of carbohydrate a day and we've replaced it with 20 grams of animal protein, this would indicate a higher risk of all cause. That means all causes of mortality and higher risk of cancer. When we use a higher vegetable intake, still have the same amount of low carbohydrate, and our protein and fats are coming more from plant sources, it was a lower mortality and cardiovascular mortality. So I think that's a really important part here because we're always concerned about insulin resistance. And as we talk about keto and different ways to manage insulin sensitivity, this is one of the approaches has been a low carb diet. And we can do a low carb diet and emphasize more plant sources of protein and fat and more vegetables. So if that's something that somebody's doing, I would hang my hat on that type. If I feel better with low carbs and I get better clinical outcomes, I would definitely not replace those grams with an animal source of protein and fat, based on what I'm seeing from these large studies with lots of evidence. Similarly, when we see people with type 2 diabetes, the greater adherence to this low carbohydrate diet pattern that emphasized plants, sources of fat and protein, it was significantly associated with a total cardiovascular and cancer mortality, much lower risk. So I think it's important for us that when we look at real world epidemiologic studies, and that's what epidemiologic studies are, it's like, I think about Dr. Phil when he'd say, how's that working for you? When we look at populations, this is real world studies. And I know that a lot of nutrition has to be done in observational and epidemiologic studies, but this is how we can follow patterns of people in different cultures and different diets, and we can determine what the outcomes are, because it's very difficult for us to do a lot of randomized control, long-term studies, intervention trials that we do with drugs and we can do with, medications and things so much easier. But when it comes to nutrition, we're going to always see that shortfall because we're not going to risk someone's life. If the study shows that there's a different outcome and we did a randomized control trial, we have to stop the study. So it makes it very difficult to do a long-term nutrition randomized clinical trials, or people don't adhere to it. So there's a lot of benefit, and we learn a lot from large cohorts that we follow for decades, all the way through their entire life. And we get to see what their diets are like, how they actually live. So the amount of carbohydrates in a low carbohydrate diet pattern was much higher than what was used in the controlled intervention studies for the ketogenic or the very low carbohydrate. So that was important to note, that a ketogenic diet is extremely low carbohydrate. And so when we're talking about a low carbohydrate, it wouldn't qualify as being ketotic or being in ketosis. So I think that's important, that low carb diet patterns had these kinds of results, but it was not very low carb. It would not be considered ketogenic. Another highlight that Frank Hugh highlighted was in healthy eating, the polyphenol rich plant foods. Polyphenols are a diverse group. This is where the natural occurring compounds are found that cause the color. We've talked a lot about these healing foods that fight cancer, and they're found in plant-based foods: fruits, vegetables, whole grains, nuts, legumes, beans, soy products, coffee, tea, cocoa, red wine, herbs, and spices. We're also looking at what causes the color in the food. So there's thousands of these polyphenols, and they can be categorized into subclasses, including the flavonoids. These are in fruits, vegetables, tea, coffee, cocoa, and soy. Lignans, we talked about those being the highest in flaxseed, but they're in all the seeds, grains, and vegetables. The phenolic acids, they're found in coffee, nuts, and fruit. And this resveratrol, this is what we see in grapes and in wine. So because of their antioxidant, anti-inflammatory, and anti-carcinogenic properties, these polyphenol-rich foods are considered a really important component of a healthy diet pattern that promotes overall health and well-being. So that's when we talked about maintaining an ideal body weight is very important. And even that lower BMI down to like pushing 22, 23 BMI, not below 18 and a half and not above 22 to 23 is a great place to sit. But also making sure that the diet includes these polyphenols, includes the fibers and these healthy foods that are so important for us, and the macronutrient distribution. So these are cardiometabolic, these polyphenols. They improve blood lipid profile. So we're talking about cholesterol, high density lipoproteins, low density lipoproteins, triglycerides. They reduce blood pressure. These polyphenols have the potential to improve cognitive function. And we've seen some of these studies where even within 1 hour to 4 hours to 6 hours, people that have full dementia have an improved memory for several hours after the consumption of these foods. So they really relax the arterial wall and heal, but they have to continue to be dosed. It's like we can't have blueberries on Monday and see the benefit on Friday. These are part of our daily diet if we want to see the long-term benefit. So the polyphenols have the potential to improve cognitive function, improve our memory, and lower the risk of these neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's and dementia. Furthermore, they also act like prebiotics. So this is a big part of how do we grow a healthy gut microbiome. And we need the prebiotics. That's the fuel. And that's how we can build and maintain a healthy gut. And that's super important as we look at boosting our immune system. That's part of our way that we can maintain a healthy body weight, is having a healthy gut. And when we have a low fiber diet, we see a problem with healthy gut. When we don't eat enough fruits and vegetables, these are those prebiotics. And we begin to see that now we're needing to take probiotics because people's guts are not healthy. Or we took an antibiotic and it stripped the gut from its healthy environment, took the good bacteria and the bad bacteria, and we've got to rebuild the gut. We talked before that in 7 days on a plant-based diet, we can heal the gut with whole food plant-based. So we're getting a lot of these fibers, lots of fruits and vegetables. We're not doing a lot of the refined sugars, things like that. And we can rebuild the gut, and it can be protective against cancer. So I think it's great that we see some of these epidemiologic studies. There's also a lot of clinical trial evidence of the health benefits of these polyphenol-rich foods like the coffee, the tea, the extra virgin olive oil, blueberries, always on the list. That's the logo for Dr. Cheryl Wellness. Avocados, these herbs and spices that are awesome. I did that in the corn chowder last week that I made, and I did an Instagram post on that corn chowder and just showed how I boosted the cancer fighting benefit by throwing turmeric into my corn chowder and adding different seasonings and vegetables that could boost the cancer fighting effect. So it's really important for us to make sure that in our healthy diet that we have foods that are rich in these polyphenols, and they also contain so many other beneficial nutrients, vitamins, minerals, the carotenoids, which are phytochemicals with antioxidant benefits. These also are plant foods. They have lots of color, and they have been very much associated with fighting cancer and other chronic diseases. So the health benefits from these types of foods, not just the polyphenols alone, really pull together and make what we would say is part of a healthy diet. Some of the other things that was pointed out in these articles was the traditional diets, the Mediterranean, the Nordic, and the Okinawa, and also some of the contemporary diet patterns. Those are some of the epidemiologic diets that we see for people that live in certain areas, traditional diets, but the contemporary diets are like a healthy plant-based diet index, the DASH diet. This is one that was a dietary approach to stop hypertension. We've seen that diet promoted by the American Dietary Guidelines, and also the Alternative Healthy Eating Index that's been associated with lower mortality and healthy longevity. So these are patterns that are predominantly nutrient-rich whole plant foods. They're limited in red and processed meat. They have lots of culinary herbs and spices relevant to their global cuisine, and they embrace distinct elements, fruits, vegetables that are native to their culture. But they still come together as plant-based foods, regardless of where they're grown or what's specific to that native area. So a fourth part of a healthy diet is combining it with lifestyle factors. So we can look at a healthy diet, but if we're trying to live our healthiest life, our most vibrant life, it also to extend a disease-free life expectancy, when we add lifestyle factors, and that's where we see how we can extend life expectancy by 8 to 10 years. And when we adhere to these core principles of a healthy diet, then we're adapting these recommendations based on our individual preferences, the culture that we are in, our availability, and also the needs of an aging population. It's really important for us to also look at how much we're moving. What about our alcohol intake, smoking, and maintaining a healthy body weight? These are all important factors in extending our life expectancy. So, longer life expectancy is something that we see lots of great research with a decline in the prevalence of these chronic diseases by eating healthy and following a healthy lifestyle. It's estimated that there's 11 million premature deaths that's per year that are attributable to an unhealthy dietary factors, including high sodium, trans fats, low fruit intake, low vegetable intake, not eating enough nuts, not eating enough omega-3 fatty acids, eating too much sodium, not enough potassium. And as we look at a high intake of processed meats and red meats, we see more problems with premature death. So the concept of a healthy longevity is really about attention to how do we increase our life expectancy, but also the length of life that we live free from chronic disease. That's essentially what we're talking about. It's been referred to as health span. And some of the two large cohort studies that we use a lot for a lot of this research is the Nurses Health Study and also the health professionals follow-up study. And this is a lot of physicians in the second study because we needed a mix of the Nurses Health Study was predominantly female and the health professionals had a little bit more male. So it gave us a mix of gender. And these are some of the largest, longest running cohorts studies on diet and health in the world. So besides these large sample sizes, there's a long duration of follow-up spanning more than 3 decades with high rates of follow-up, greater than 90% follow-up in these cohorts. Detailed data on diet and lifestyle factors have been collected from these people every 2 to 3 years of their life. And the reported measures of diet are particularly useful in reducing measurements and being able to look at how self-reported diets and how can we represent long-term dietary habits. And these studies is very as accurate as we can get. It's very difficult, like we said, because large randomized controlled trials with diet and longevity are just very difficult, not feasible due to a lack of long-term adherence, cost consideration. Observational data derived from high quality cohorts is some of our best work. And then insights that we add to this from small randomized control trials in humans and also experimental data that we see from animal studies. So we look at a lot of these animal studies because they have a shorter lifespan and we can see how it affects the animal. And it's like first step to move this to a larger randomized control trial in humans. So that's an important part of how we look at the research that comes behind nutrition and how do we look at what a healthy diet is. So we're not just talking about low carb or high protein. It's about understanding the balance of these macronutrients, carbohydrate, protein, fat, and even not overlooking the important role of the micronutrients like these polyphenols and their role in fighting disease, and always remembering to get that energy balance because it's very important that we live at a healthy body weight. So that's part of the puzzle. But the other is protein. And I find that there's a lot of confusion as to this macronutrient. It's surrounded by controversy and confusion. Are all proteins created equal? What's the difference between an animal protein versus a plant protein? The different amino acid structures. And we're going to look at the health impacts of red and processed meat and discuss the crucial role of these specific amino acids like arginine, lysine, leucine is some of the newest studies that just came out. How do they affect our health? And particularly in relation to diseases like atherosclerosis and cancer. So it's really important, and we want to clear the air in this section on some of the protein myths and give you some of the facts that you need so that you can make an informed dietary choices. And so one of the things we always want to remember is that protein makes us feel full. Protein in our diet crushes hunger. So if we're looking at a weight loss diet, we're always going to be hearing raise the protein levels. And sometimes we see people saying, how much protein do we need? I'm hearing a lot of people saying 30 to 35 grams of protein per meal. 100 grams of protein per day. These numbers are coming from all kinds of sources. Technically, as we look at it as health professionals, protein has been based on body weight and how much we weigh and how much protein that we need per body weight. But as we begin to look at different people's needs, every cell in the body needs protein. We need it to build and repair cells and body tissue, including skin, hair, muscle, and bone. It's also important for blood clotting. Our immune system needs protein. Our hormones and enzymes all need protein. So it seems like we're going to need a lot of protein because the role of protein is so important. But protein also comes with a two-edged sword because it's loaded with nitrogen and what type of protein and how acidic is the protein. So there's many we could talk about protein essentially in our whole year of this podcast. But what I'd really like to highlight is that most of our protein rich foods also contain high levels of minerals like iron, magnesium, and zinc. So, depending upon your source of protein, if it's animal and plant protein, it would determine what other micronutrients come with it. So, animal sources are meat, poultry, fish, eggs, plant proteins, beans, nuts, soy. These are all plant proteins. Seeds have plant protein as well. And these are the options that people that are on plant based diets and where they get the majority of their protein. I thought it was interesting. The Food and Drug Administration says that people should get 50 grams of protein per day for people that are on a 2,000 calorie diet. And as we age, we need more protein. And what I find is that if people go on a calorie restricted diet, the amount of protein, the percent, if we're looking at the percent of protein, it will go up. But the grams of protein will essentially match our body weight and our activity levels and the stress to our body. I have found when I was working as a registered dietitian before I did my doctoral work, burn patients, patients with head trauma, the protein intakes were very high as when we saw brain injury. And so I think it really depends on the patient's condition, but definitely when we see a burn victim, it's very difficult to get enough protein in them. So it does determine based on what our medical needs are, what our health condition is. But for the average healthy person, it will be based a lot on our body. Our body weight and what the healthy body weight is. So if we're 100 pounds overweight, we usually give protein to feed what your healthy body weight would actually be, not your actual body weight. And when we're eating protein, again, it helps us feel full. And that can lead people to eating less calories. So many high protein diets are part of with low carbohydrate, which has been considered driving hunger. Depending upon how our blood sugar curves go after meals, we're going to see a lot of weight loss diets are going to be trending towards smaller amounts of carbohydrate and higher amounts of protein. Hence why I've talked about my concern in these quick, easy, permanent weight loss diets that will help you feel more full. You might reach an ideal body weight, but you may have raised your risk for cancer. You may have raised your risk for heart disease or these lifestyle diseases or dementia or Alzheimer's disease or stroke because of how you've shifted your food so that you could lose weight. So I just think it's really important for us to look at the whole package. How can we live a healthy body weight eating the healthiest foods possible? That's the formula, and making the healthiest lifestyle choices that we can. Not smoking or vaping, limiting our alcohol intake to no more than 1 serving per day and no more than 5 per week. And if you don't drink alcohol, don't start for health purposes. This is just for people that want this to be in their lifestyle. But there's the health benefit of resveratrol with wine can be given in grape juice and other plant foods. So we don't need to get resveratrol from wine. It just happens to have it. And so we do get a benefit from it, but the benefit is not coming particularly from the alcohol. It's coming from the resveratrol. But I wanted to talk about animal protein, especially the red meat and the processed meat and plant proteins. And when we look at some of the studies that talk about protein, the interaction between protein intake and age on mortality. In this nurses' health study and this health professional study, higher animal protein intake was positively associated. That means it increased the risk for cardiovascular mortality. That's dying from cardiovascular disease. Whereas the higher plant protein intake was inversely associated with all-cause mortality and cardiovascular mortality. And that's an important thing to look at because these are big, respected studies. And in substitution analysis, if we replaced an animal protein source, especially a red meat or a processed meat, with a plant protein source, it was associated with a significantly lower risk of all-cause mortality. There is so much evidence of this. It's very clear. And as we look at the World Health Organization, as we look at the dietary guidelines, we look at the American Heart Association, it's very clear across the board that this has been recognized by our national organizations that when we replace animal protein sources and eat less red meat, less processed meat, and replace them with a plant protein, it was associated with lower risk of all-cause mortality and a lower risk of cancer and heart disease. So again, we're looking at how can we ride the cancer prevention wave because we see these tumors headed our way. And I would suggest that the trend of a low carbohydrate diet with a high protein diet to reach a healthy body weight and to build muscle that is so big right now that the replacement of what we were eating, yes, those refined carbohydrates, white flour, white sugar, all of those, we see all kinds of health problems eating those foods. But when we think of carbohydrate, we need to also think about foods like beans have carbohydrate, and we see the healing effect. We can get our carbohydrate from whole plant foods, vegetables, fruits. These are carbohydrates, and they're loaded with polyphenols that are cancer preventing. And we can reach our health goals with those types of carbohydrates. So all carbohydrates are not created equal, nor are all proteins, nor are all fats. So I think that my summary of what I would say about these macronutrients and where I hang my hat on them is that we've accepted that not all fats are the same. We've accepted that not all carbohydrates are the same. Potatoes are different than white sugar in any kind of study because they're a whole food. They're soluble fiber. The soluble fiber in the stomach binds to the sugars and slows and reduces our blood sugar meal response. We don't get that when we're having a sugar soda, when we're having high sugar intake. There's nothing slowing down that response unless we're eating it with a full meal loaded with soluble fiber or a soluble fiber supplement, like taking psyllium with our meal, which some of the research studies have done that, so that we can, if we're not going to change our lifestyle, can we add psyllium fiber, which is essentially taking Metamucil at every single meal so that we can lower cholesterol and we can reduce and delay post blood sugar response. But we can do that with food. That's what we can do with an apple. So there's sugar in the apple, yes, but there's also the soluble fiber in the apple that helps to reduce and delay the post blood sugar response. Then we get the benefits of the apple skin that fights cancer. It lowers cholesterol, and it will have a positive impact on diabetes because we're not seeing a problem with diabetes and blood sugar response from whole fruits. We're seeing the problem with refined foods. There are very few people that are so sensitive that I cannot give them whole apples with the skin and whole fruit. I have had maybe in the people that have come through the Take 10 program, maybe 5% or not even 10% of all of the people with the most brittle diabetes, sensitive blood sugars, based on having diabetes for many, many years before they came to the program. And I was still able to give them apples, but I had to do it at noon and not at breakfast. And I literally was still able to give fruits, but I found that not at the very first meal of the day. But I literally am always trying to figure out how I can get whole fruits and all those polyphenols in people that have diabetes so that they have the same benefit to healing their blood vessels. Because with diabetes, it's a disease of the vessel. And with diabetes, because of running high blood sugars, we begin to see angiogenesis restricted. So we're trying to relax and improve circulation and boost angiogenesis so that we can increase circulation to get to the cells, protect our nerves. And we need to do that by keeping our blood sugar levels low. We also fight cancer in the same way. So again, more whole foods do that. And the more polyphenols that we can get in the diet do that. So in these studies, what we found, coming back to protein sources and the importance of the type of protein source in the Nurses Health study and in this health professional study where it was more male, an increase of just one serving of processed and unprocessed red meat per day was linked to a 13% and a 20% increased risk of mortality. So I think this is very important. In the Nurses Health study, it was 13%, and in the health professional study, it was a 20% increased risk of mortality. And as we look at replacing one serving of red meat per day with other foods like fish, poultry, legumes, nuts, low-fat dairy, whole grains, it was associated with a 7% to a 19% lower risk of premature death. So these are the results from these large cohorts, observing people for decades and getting information from them their entire life. These are some of the best studies that we have in nutrition, and it's our best that we have in our hand to look at and to follow. And based on these estimates, if all study participants in the cohorts had consumed less than a half serving of red meat per day, 9.3% of deaths in men and 7.6% in women could have been prevented. There are several systematic reviews and meta-analysis that have consistently found that higher consumption of red meat and processed meats were significantly associated with an increased risk of developing type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, cancers, specifically, especially colorectal cancer. And what have we been talking about? The rise in people 50 and under has been a surge of colorectal cancer and breast cancers. And as we look at colorectal cancer, we can look at red meat and processed meat and say, this may be this would be a target. This is what I would be looking at as I look at what is the best information that we have in our hand right now that we can do something about, that we know about. So I think this is very important for us to pay close attention to the new studies that have just come out saying processed meat and unprocessed red meats are okay and there is no risk. So what we're seeing is habitual consumption of unprocessed, that just means regular red meat, and processed red meat was associated with a higher or a moderately higher risk of frailty. So that was defined as having 3 or more of the criteria of the frail scale, which is fatigue, low strength, reduced aerobic capacity, having greater than 5 illnesses, and a weight loss of greater than 5%. So replacement of red meat by plant protein sources was associated with a lower risk of these 5 fatality scores. Again, fatigue, low strength, reduced aerobic capacity, having 5 or more illnesses, and a weight loss of greater than or equal 5%. These are things that are stealing our quality of life. And so as we're talking about regaining strength, feeling good, getting our energy back, we can see that unprocessed red meats and processed red meats are not looking good in the studies that we are seeing that really are the best studies that we have in our hand. As we look at nuts, these are a plant protein and a healthy fat combined together, and they have been studied extensively for their benefits of reducing risk of chronic disease and mortality. There's been a lot of studies showing just a handful of nuts, mixed nuts, 3 times a week. This was in the Adventist Health study years ago, decrease the risk of heart attack by 47 to 50%. So those were big studies that we saw in the 80s, 90s, again, looking at epidemiologic studies. Now we're looking at numerous short-term randomized control trials that have shown that incorporating nuts into regular diets significantly reduce the total and the LDL cholesterol. So we're talking about eating, the protein is from a plant nut, and the fats, they're very high in fat, but we're still seeing a drop in LDL cholesterol levels. So that's exciting to know that we can eat fat, we can feel full from the protein, and nuts don't give us the same issues that we're having with the processed and non-processed meats. Some of the large cohort studies have shown that regular consumption of nuts was associated with significantly lower risk of type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, cancers, and mortality. Peanuts were interesting because peanuts, are botanically a legume. And they're a high fat legume is what I call them. And they appear to confer with the similar health benefits as tree nuts. So that was exciting to know. I'm allergic to peanuts, and I think that it's more the mold because I'm very allergic to mold. But I grew up eating peanuts, and I grew up as a vegetarian. I am not pushing vegetarian. I'm just pushing the science here. But my parents made the decision when I was young. My dad raised on a farm. They had all their own beef. It was all grass fed, dairy farm, beef. All of those were coming from our own farm. But when my dad decided to move away from the farm, he saw the condition of the meat that we would get in restaurants and what we would have available in a grocery store. And it would be very different than raising our own. And my dad made the decision that to raise his kids vegetarian, which is what we did. And so I think it's when you're a vegetarian, you're getting a lot of nuts in your diet because that's a part of your every single meal, and peanut butters and almond butters and all these kinds of things. We made all kinds of things with nuts. And today, even I do a lot of cheeses and sauces that I use nuts and pine nuts for that are really delicious. But what we see here is that in the Nurses Health Study and this health professional study, participants in these studies who seldom ate nuts versus those who consume nuts at least once daily had a 20% lower death rate than those that seldom ate nuts. So there was an inverse association, and it was similar for peanuts and tree nuts. So in addition, the habitual consumption of nuts was associated significantly with this lower risk of frailty. So I think that's super important for us to look at that. And as we look at healthy aging, the value of nuts. And if someone can't chew well and they're older, let's think about the nut butters that are available and the power of these nuts. They're definitely a food as medicine that have a lot of value. So when we, coming back to eating a high protein diet, when we're looking at weight loss, many people decide to adopt a high protein diet because they want to feel full and they're eating less calories. So the percentage of protein seems higher. So it can look like it's a high protein diet, but we still just need so many grams of protein every day to be a part of a healthy diet. And if we want to eat less of the carbohydrates, it's fine. But my recommendation would be to replace those carbohydrate calories with plant sources of protein and plant sources of fat, eating more beans, legumes, if you like eggs, dairy, even the fish, these would be better quality proteins. Also, there's a lot of protein in spinach and dark leafy vegetables. And I'm missing one here. Oh, yes, and the nuts and the seeds. So that's where we can get a lot of our replacement for some of the carbohydrates, as well as the avocado, when we're seeing the soluble fiber in avocado and the health benefits from that type of a healthy plant fat. So when people on a weight loss diet go on a high protein diet, they reduce their carbohydrate intake, and so many times they will limit now their consumption of highly processed foods. They stop eating the bread, they stop eating the baked goods, the candy, the white pasta, and the sugar, and they start to feel better. And what we have to look at in is a low carb diet healthy? Is a high carb diet healthy? Again, it's the type of carbohydrate. So if you going on a low carbohydrate diet, you had a lot of benefits. I often say, if you've lost a lot of weight because you went on a low carb diet, maybe your trigger foods are these processed carbs. And then if you are eliminating whatever the culprit is, you're going to have better outcomes. But what I find is if somebody goes on a high protein diet, like an Atkins diet, and they did not have success with this, and they've raised the protein in their diet, but they already loved steak and they loved animal proteins already, then they don't do well in the Atkins diet. So there's 50% that never did well in a high protein diet and low carbohydrate. We don't talk about that. We talk about the 50% that do well. And I like to differentiate between those two groups because my observation of this has been, if you give up your trigger food of whatever you overeat, whatever diet you go on that has you do that for during the terms of this restrictive diet, you'll have better outcomes. But if you go on a high protein diet and you already love high protein and you already eat a lot of protein, then you may not lose weight and you may not have any health benefits. But if you gave up carbohydrates and that was the culprit, you were eating donuts every day and you stopped donuts and you stopped chips, right there, you would see a benefit to this diet change. But if we could look at the types of carbohydrate and we started eating more whole plant fruits, then those are carbohydrates, but they're the healthy ones. If we could start eating more vegetables, the beans that come with protein and plant protein and whole carbohydrate, we're going to start to see that it's the type of carbohydrate. So I really like to talk a lot about that because anytime we give up our trigger food, we will see success. And we're talking about high protein diet plans, and we're talking about things that started with the Atkins diet, where we had high protein diets and we had a low carbohydrate. Now, don't confuse this with the ketogenic diet, because the ketogenic diet is not high in protein. It is specifically raising the fat content, because even protein will convert to sugar. So if you want the body to become ketotic or be in a ketosis state, which is the goal, and we see this began with the whipped cream diet, and it was for patients that were having seizures or any kind of brain problem. And we still see this, that a ketogenic diet may have its place with some different brain tumors, different seizure conditions, different mental conditions that people may have that is affecting brain health. But overall, as we see people eating protein and whole carbohydrate, and healthy people or people preventing, and we're not related to some specialty type diet, what we find is that when we're replacing and we're going to a high protein diet, we're dropping our carbohydrate. Anytime we drop a trigger food like donuts, white flour, white sugar, chips, whatever our trigger food was, if we go on a diet that's high protein and now we've stopped all of our junk food, and dropped our processed sugar intake, and probably dropped our salt intake as well, we'll see some health benefit. And that might say, if that happened for our friend or our brother or this health professional, now all of a sudden this becomes a public health message. And what I often say is that it's really hard to apply, excuse me, what works for one person to apply to another. Because what we know in a healthy diet is that carbohydrates are not all created equal, fats are not all created equal, dietary fat, and neither is protein. They have different outcomes. So a gram of protein, and what we see in this research, and we've talked about this today, is the type of protein gram by gram makes a very big difference in the health outcome. So when we're switching processed meat, red meats, for one plant protein, just 3 ounces a day, we're dropping our risk for disease significantly. That's something to pay attention to. So as we're looking here, does a high protein intake also cause more heart disease? It's very important for us to look at these studies and say that even though high protein diets are very popular, they're used for weight loss, bodybuilding, and overall healthy lifestyle, the research has used experiments in animal models and have shown that high protein diets increase cardiovascular risk and also atherosclerosis or hardening of the arteries. The why is what a lot of people haven't known. Why would a high protein diet be at risk for our heart and our arteries? I'm seeing the responses to these studies looking at the role of leucine, the amino acid. I've looked for a lot of years at these amino acids at arginine and lysine, and higher arginine ratio to lysine is what we see in plant-based foods, and that's what's in nuts. So as we think about why are nuts reducing cardiovascular disease risk, one of the big thoughts is that it's because it's higher in arginine, lower in lysine compared to animal protein. Now, this study is looking at leucine. This is that amino acid, and looking at it, it's higher in animal-based foods as well. And is it the driving force for this atherosclerosis risk? Lots of studies, a lot of people throwing out this study because it's based on mutant mice, is what I've heard. So it's discredited. But this is how all of our studies began, even with drugs, as we start with an animal model, and we have to pay attention to what this model is. And so if my family had heart disease, it's the number one killer in of lifestyle related diseases. And we see studies showing plant protein more protective than these animal proteins. It might be something to pay attention to. So I'm not going to dive deep into that study, other than there is so much studied as we look at these large cohort studies, that choosing the right food, if we're going to eat a high protein diet, is really important for the maximum effectiveness. If you feel best on a high protein diet, then focus on eating leaner cuts of beef, chicken breasts, turkey breasts, eggs, beans. Think about less of the processed meats, less of the red meat, and exchanging that for dairy or eggs or beans, nuts and seeds, and these healthier fish, if you can get a good source of salmon, these omega-3 fatty acids, whole grains, lentils, quinoa, chickpeas, some of the dairy products like the Greek yogurts, and then, of course, tons of vegetables and whole fruit. But in addition to aiding in weight loss, protein provides the body with a lot of essential benefits. So there's many benefits. We've talked about that: repairing skin, hair, bones, building muscle. So we think if we eat more protein, we'll build more muscle, and we don't. If we eat more protein, we need to eat enough protein. But if we eat excess protein, it turns to fat as well. It doesn't turn to muscle. So I think it's very important for us to be aware of that. I think it's also important to know that a high protein diet is a concern for those that have kidney disease or have risk for kidney disease, because this comes with a lot of nitrogen that the kidney has to eliminate. And sometimes people that are very sensitive, having a high protein diet, when people have kidney disease, when somebody is pre-dialysis, if I put them on more plant protein, a lower protein diet, I can extend their years of not going on dialysis. And that's a very big deal. And so that's just some of my clinical experience with people with kidney disease, and being able to help them by changing the types of protein. So we see a lot of research for kidney disease that we can look at more plant protein and less animal protein, and a smaller total grams of protein for people that have kidney disease. But as we're looking at high protein and we're looking at it as a weight loss diet, it's just very important for us to think. A lot of the recommendation is 25 to 30 grams per meal. I have found that 20 grams of protein per meal with 20 grams of whole healthy plant fat is a combination that works. So if you need to do less protein, you can do more of the avocado. You can do more of the nuts, so that you're getting a protein, but you're also bringing in some of the healthy plant fats. Because I think fats, this is where the ketogenic diet, I'm sort of in that field of, I like healthy plant fats a lot for satiety and for that keeping us full and helping people to balance their blood sugar. And you don't have to push such high amounts of protein. But 25 to 30 grams of protein is totally fine at a meal. Adding 20 grams of healthy plant fat, that will keep you full if you ate that much at a meal. I think very few people can eat that much. When I've tried to feed that, and I'm doing it from more whole plant foods, very few people can actually eat those calories unless they're eating them in a more processed way, like eating them in meat. Because I consider meat, dairy, eggs more processed foods. The animal processed that food instead of a factory, but the animal ate the grass and excreted the fiber, burned the carbohydrate, stored it as muscle, and we're eating the muscle, which is marbleized with fat. And so as we think about what we're doing, we are eating a processed plant food in some form as we eat meat. So there's animal foods, dairy products, fish come with no fiber. And I think that's very important. So I just really looking at the different opinions of the amount of protein is something I really wanted to talk about today, and the type of protein and how nutrition research draws out causation. And those are my concerns, because is eating this much protein bad for your heart? That's a response. And Peter Attia made a comment in one of his social posts that seeing these studies about high protein intakes contributing to atherosclerosis has limited relevance to anyone but the mutant mice or the transgenic mice, and it doesn't correlate to humans. But we've seen lots of research, Dr. Jenkins' research. I can just challenge that with so much research, that cohorts of observational epidemiologic studies that have shown this, as well as randomized control trials that have shown that the type of amino acid structure, more arginine to lysine ratio in plant-based foods, shifting processed meat and red meats to plant-based foods. And I would challenge the statement that I think it's very important for us to not think that some of these studies don't correlate to humans, because we'd have to apply that to all of our studies then and come back to every single study and tear it apart with that same argument. Again, we do have limitation in nutrition research, and it is a real problem. But also, Peter Attia's latest quote is, the best diet, if it's in excess, regardless of what you think the best diet is, if it's keto, paleo, low carb, the Mediterranean diet, vegan, any of these diets, if we consume them in excess, we're going to be unhealthy. And I totally agree with Dr. Peter Attia with that. It's very important for us to be at a healthy body weight and a healthy diet and making positive and healthy lifestyle choices. So his point is he'd rather have us score a 7 out of 10 in quality of diet and sustain it for life than a 10 out of 10 and only do it for 6 months and go back to what you were doing. And I totally agree. This is baby steps. It's making lifestyle change. And I think it's really important. And again, he cautions for people not to major on the minor. And when we're fighting in these dietary tribes on this. So I definitely find that there are dietary tribes. And I find that even among researchers that if they're in the Mediterranean diet group, if they're in the Atkins group, if they're in the low carb group, if they're in the high protein group, if they're in the vegan group, they don't talk. And it's like, what would be great is if we could have a non-biased opinion and we could all have honest conversations of this study showed us this. Well, there might be some benefits to a lower carb diet for certain people and certain cultures and certain populations, maybe that have high risk of kidney disease or people that have risk for diabetes. I think that we need to look at how people feel best and listen to them and what are their comfort foods, and then take those foods and try to figure out, like I've talked a lot about Cheetos for me. Cheetos made me feel better. So if I would eat a lot of refined sugar and then I had Cheetos, I felt so much better. And I began to find that my new healthy Cheetos were nuts. So every day I start my day with nuts, and it makes a whole difference in me because, again, I am a vegetarian. I do not eat, I eat some dairy, I eat some eggs, but I'm predominantly whole food, plant-based diet because that's been my whole life. So for me, eating meat is just not an option for me, not appealing to me in any reference. And so I think it's very important for us to not try to demonize what we don't do and try to defend what we do, but to just have honest conversations. If somebody feels really good eating red meat, processed meat, I just want the information to be shared so that we know what's the healthiest way to live. And then make your choice however you want to live. I saw Rachel Paul make a comment, is red meat bad? A social that she posted today. The relationship between processed meat, red meat, and the risk of cardiovascular disease and type 2 diabetes. And this study that she's posting that it just has come out says that there is no causation. And to find causation, I see Rachel Paul's comment, from my scientific opinion, what hasn't been stifled is how people are eating whole ingredient processed meats like turkeys. It hasn't been researched, I should say, is when people are eating the types of food that she recommends in her weight loss program. She's got to defend that. So if they have a healthy diet that's got fiber, healthy plant fats, they're going to have better health outcomes. And she's making an appeal that people who eat a lot of bacon, salami also eat a lot of highly processed foods like chips and pizza. She's making this stretch to say that that would be what she thinks is the problem. So if we take away the pepperoni, we took away the pizza. And so we're blaming this for what was caused by this. And that's what I saw in her social post. And I think it's very important for us, she's making the comment, it's difficult to parse out what is the problem. Is it the red meat and the processed meat, or is it the white hamburger bun, or is it the burger inside that bun? Is it the milk, or is it the frappuccino that's loaded with the sugar? And so she makes very good points here. But as she's looking at, in her scientific opinion, she's having a hard time believing that high quality organic meats of any kind are not part of an overall healthy diet, and that the true problem is from the other foods that are eating. So these are parts of the discrepancy. So we see somebody with a PhD in, it's not nutrition. Her PhD is in behavioral change. She's a registered dietitian, and she's trying to help people create a lifestyle. And I respect that. And I've seen her program. Same with Peter Attia. And I think that's the goal for me as well. With a doctor of clinical nutrition, this is my specialty beyond being a dietitian. And I'm just saying that it is very important to make small, steady steps, but it's also important to get accurate information and not defend or get into a trend or a corner that we're defending. So that would be my appeal, is regardless of how you eat, let's follow the science and let's see where it goes. But I think that as we look at exploring a healthy diet, I want to also make the point that it matters. There's a symphony of our lifestyle. So, healthy diet is just one part of it. And we have to synergistically combine it with other lifestyle factors like exercise, maintaining a healthy body weight, and doing that with a healthy diet, avoiding smoking, and limiting our alcohol intake or not drinking any alcohol at all. Alcohol and estrogen don't mix well. So remember, one or less servings per day and a maximum of 5 per week. Not having alcohol as part of your daily lifestyle. I think these are the things that are causing the cancer tidal wave to rear its head. And how can we prevent cancer? How can we fight disease? Is looking at these lifestyle factors as well. One of the things that I want to look at as I give my feedback on it is I'm just reminded by historically reflecting on the echoing the war, the tobacco war. And as I'm looking at processed meat, unprocessed meat, looking at the research saying there was no causation. We're looking at observational studies. We're looking at epidemiologic studies. That was a mouse study. We're not giving that credibility. As we look at this whole battle that's going on, it's just like what was happening with tobacco. Once we start to see these small studies that lead to larger studies, it takes decades for us to move from where a researcher is seeing some really astounding work, like realizing that everybody was smoking and the problem was smoking causing cancer, took decades. And unfortunately, many people didn't have the right information and people were defending it because they wanted to continue to do it. And I would just caution us that if we want to look at how little do I need to smoke to not get lung cancer, then we're going to start to look at, what our goals are. We can make all these choices, but it took decades to create causation of tobacco causes lung disease, because now that's very difficult to do and to create. And it takes decades once you start to see the observational studies, the epidemiologic studies. Now we've got to move this into causation. Very difficult to do. This is what Rachel Paul's calling for. And she's not recommending pulling back when we're seeing the red flags. And what I would simply say is we've been seeing red flags on red meat and processed meat and saturated fats. We've been animal saturated fats, I should say, refined sugars and high salt and low potassium. We've been seeing red flags on these foods for decades, and they're just starting, like alcohol. It's in the 1990s to 2000, it was if you're not drinking alcohol, you should start because it's heart healthy. And then all of a sudden in 2000, you start to look at the American dietary guidelines and the alcohol intake guidelines from our United States. Next thing you know, you start following that. And I followed that. The recommendations every 5 years began to all of a sudden slowly change. And it was like, if you're not drinking, don't start because the benefits don't outweigh the negative. And we began to see an increase in cancer, breast cancer for women, as we began to encourage women to drink alcohol in the 90s specifically. And now we're seeing those the guidelines for alcohol totally change. And after we see our United States dietary guidelines begin to change, it takes a long time. Again, we talked about that. It's like moving the battleship to move how people actually live and eat in public health. So I would just reflect that my goal is not to look at how much can I smoke and not get lung cancer? How much red meat, processed meat can I eat and not get cancer, not get colorectal cancer, not increase my risk of cancer? We don't know that exact amount, but what we do know is dropping 3 ounces. That's hardly anything. That's less than the palm of my hand, 3 ounces, and replacing it with a plant protein, even a dairy, even salmon, some of the healthy fish, changed our risk dramatically. So we have to pay attention that if we just saw that sensitivity of 3-ounce change in cohort studies, that's really powerful. So what I would just say is let's don't get in the tobacco war with red meat and processed meat. Let's pay attention. Let's watch it carefully. And if these are your comfort foods, maybe look at pulling back 3 ounces. Not, well, I can never have this food again. And again, it's making small steps so that we can get to live our healthiest, most vibrant life. That's what the goal is. So as we're trying to create causation, again, it takes decades from when we saw tobacco was a problem to when we were finally able to prove causation. And that's exactly what's going to happen in nutrition research with alcohol, red meat, these food, all of these things are all in the process, but we're getting the warnings. We're seeing our United States government beginning to say, if you don't drink, don't start. That's something we should pay attention to. That means there's red flags. Limit the amount of red meat, limit the amount of processed meat. And remember, the World Health Organization is saying that these are carcinogenic foods. So they're like smoking. That's the same. A carcinogenic food is a carcinogenic element that we're putting in our body by choice. And so I take that as the warning that I need to recommend limiting those foods. And so those are my thoughts. I want to wrap up my personal insight on what I think is very important to follow the science without bias. I'm including researchers in this. I'm including how we fund these studies and how they're interpreted by people that are not specialists in nutrition science and nutrition research. Again, I make the appeal, stay in our zones. I'm not doing open heart surgery. I don't try to do other specialties in medicine, but there are very few people that actually are trained in nutrition science and nutrition research. And these people should be listened to when it's time to think about nutrition and what foods do we eat? How do we live to fight and beat disease? The power of food is huge. And let's pay attention to the science. Let's get rid of the pitfalls. Let's don't defend a dietary food pattern tribe. We're not vegan. We're not diabetics. We're not identified by our diet. Let's just be as healthy as we can be. And let's be open to where the science leads us. And let's just make one healthy lifestyle choice at a time. And there's no downside in any research that I have seen to add one whole plant protein to every meal, add one healthy plant fat. That's avocado, that's nuts, seeds, olives to every meal, adding 2 cups of fruits and vegetables to every meal, boosting the polyphenols, boosting our potassium levels. It's going to boost nitric oxide, heal our blood vessels, boost our natural health defense system, fight cancer, fight all of these lifestyle diseases that we know are 50 to 75% preventable. There is no study that shows any of those recommendations are risk factors. There's no red flags on them. So again, whole fruits, not fruit juice, whole fruits. We're balancing. We're making our insulin will become more sensitive. We're improving insulin sensitivity. Insulin resistance improves. We see diabetes, less medication needed as we follow this as the foundation of our plate. And then if you want to add red meat, if you want to add processed meat, these are your favorite foods, you're doing them in smaller amounts. So we're talking about substituting a standard serving of red meat, like 3 ounces. Again, that's probably not a standard serving because it's less than the size of the palm of your hand. The palm of your hand is about 4 ounces size. With a plant protein was found to reduce coronary heart disease risk in the Nurses Health Study by 13 to 30%. And when they combined the men and the women, it had an effect of 7 to 19% reduction in coronary heart disease and all-cause mortality. So there's a lot of evidence here that there are negative health effects from eating more red and processed meat. And as we're looking at these low-carb diets that might trend us to eating more of these things, this could be our movement to how can we protect the tidal wave of cancer, colorectal cancer for those under the age of 50 that may be doing more of this. Also looking at our alcohol intake. So I'm going to keep this going next week, but I need to shut this one down for today. But I just want to say, remember, let's don't look at how can we do the least amount to be the healthiest we can be. Let's look at where's the science, make the choices, at least take one step this week, increase your wellness score. I'm all about boosting your wellness score, looking at what we're eating, and the higher score, it's a 20-point score. So the higher scores are correlated to the lowest risks for disease and the healthiest lifestyle, the most energy, the lowest amount of medication. It's how we fight disease and how we add healthy years to our life. Thank you for joining me today at the Wellness Table. I hope today's episode inspired you to take a real deep look at your plate and choose foods that truly nourish your mind, body, and soul. And keep questioning, keep learning. Let's continue this journey to health together. And let's tune in next time for more insights into the art and science of living well. Stay healthy, stay happy, and remember, true wellness is about balanced and healthy, informed choices. I'll see you at the table next time.